She was standing knee-deep in freezing river mud, her dead husband's wedding ring still on her finger, her arms locked around a dying black horse that wasn't even hers. And every man on that riverbank was laughing. "Leave it, Abigail. That animal's already dead. You're embarrassing yourself, woman." She didn't answer them. She pulled harder. That was the moment everything changed, not just for her, but for every single person who laughed that morning. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very last word, because what happens next is something nobody in Willow Creek Valley ever saw coming. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The river was angry that morning. It had been raining for 3 days straight across the Montana Territory, and the Clearwater River had swallowed its own banks the way a drunk man swallows his pride, fast, ugly, and with no apology. The water was brown and cold and moving with the kind of purpose that didn't care what was standing in its way. Abigail Carter heard the horse before she saw it. She was walking the edge of her property fence, checking for damage the storm had done overnight, when she heard it. Not a whinny, not a cry exactly, but something lower, something exhausted. The sound an animal makes when it has already decided to stop fighting, but its body hasn't caught up with the decision yet. She pushed through the brush along the riverbank and stopped. There, half submerged in the brown water, tangled in a mess of dead branches and rope and river debris, was a horse, black as a preacher's coat. Young, maybe 4 years old, maybe less. Its legs were caught, its head barely above the waterline, its chest heaving with the effort of just staying alive. One of its rear legs was twisted at a wrong angle, caught in something beneath the surface. Its eyes, dark and enormous, found her face the moment she appeared through the brush, and something in them didn't look like an animal anymore. It looked like a question. "Are you going to help me? Or are you going to walk away like everyone else?" Abigail dropped the fence wire she was carrying. She didn't think about the cold. She didn't think about the debt notice sitting on her kitchen table back at the ranch, or the 3 months of unpaid feed bills, or the fact that she hadn't eaten breakfast yet. She didn't think about the fact that she was 41 years old and alone and had no business taking on another problem when her own life was already held together with prayers and borrowed time. She stepped into the river. The cold hit her like a closed fist, straight through her boots, up her legs, into her chest. She gasped, then pushed forward. The mud at the bottom grabbed at her feet like hands. She kept moving anyway. "Easy," she said. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." The horse thrashed when she got close, scared, wild-eyed. One of its front hooves caught her across the shoulder, and the impact knocked her sideways, sent her splashing down into the shallows before she got her feet back under her. She came up spitting river water, wiping mud from her face, and the horse was still there, still struggling, still watching her. "All right," she said. "All right. You don't trust me yet. That's fair." She moved slower this time, talking low. Not commands, just words. The way you talk to someone in the dark who's scared and doesn't know where they are. She worked the rope from around its legs first. It took nearly 15 minutes, her hands going numb, the current pushing against her the whole time. She had to go partially underwater twice to free the worst tangle, and both times she came up gasping, but she kept working. When the rope finally came loose, the horse tried to move, and its bad leg buckled immediately. "I know," Abigail said. "I know it hurts, but you have to trust me for just a little longer." She got her shoulder under the horse's neck, pushed, guided, half-dragged, half-walked that animal up the muddy bank 1 foot at a time while the river tried to pull them both back. She didn't hear the men arrive until one of them laughed. Lord Almighty! She turned. 4 men on horseback, just off the main road, looking down at her from dry land. She recognized all of them. Jim Aldridge, who ran cattle on the eastern side of the valley. His brother Pete. Cal Morrison, who owned the feed store in town. And in the front, sitting easy in his saddle like a man who was comfortable being watched, Thomas Whitaker. Thomas Whitaker owned more land in Willow Creek Valley than God had intended one man to own. He had a big house, a bigger barn, and a reputation for knowing the value of everything, down to the last dollar and the last breath. He also had the kind of smile that meant he found your suffering genuinely entertaining. "Abigail Carter," Thomas said, looking her over. Muddy, soaked, half carrying a broken horse while the river dripped off her clothes. "I have seen a great many things in my years, but I do believe that is the saddest sight I have encountered this week." The other men laughed. "Is that my horse?" Thomas said, leaning forward slightly, studying the animal. "It was your horse," Abigail said. She didn't stop moving. She was still guiding the animal up the bank, one hand on its neck, speaking low between her teeth. "Before you left it to drown." Thomas didn't flinch. "I turned that animal loose 2 days ago. I told you, Jim. The moment a horse starts showing weakness in its legs, it's not worth the hay you're feeding it. That one? I gave it a clean field and an open gate. What it did after that was its own business." "You abandoned it," Abigail said. "I freed it," Thomas said pleasantly. "There's a difference. And what you're doing right now," he gestured at her, at the mud, at the horse trembling at her side. "That's not rescue, Mrs. Carter. That's sentiment. And sentiment doesn't feed anyone through a Montana winter." Thomas. That was Jim Aldridge, quiet, just a little uncomfortable. "Maybe we should—" "That horse is finished," Thomas said, talking over him. He looked at the black horse with the flat assessment of a man reading a bill of sale. "Look at the leg. Look at the weight it's lost. Even if you spend the next 6 months nursing it, which, by the way, you cannot afford, it will never run properly. It will never work. It will eat your feed, take up your space, and die in your barn sometime before spring. And then you'll have wasted everything you put into it." He said it without cruelty. That was the worst part. He said it the way a man explains arithmetic to someone slow, patient, certain, almost kind. "Mrs. Carter," Thomas continued, and his voice shifted into something that might have been genuine concern, might have been performance. She could never quite tell with Thomas Whitaker. "You are a widow woman with 60 acres of dry land, a roof that I happen to know needs replacing, and a feed bill at Morrison's that's 3 months overdue. You cannot afford—" "Don't," she said. Her voice came out quiet, not angry, not pleading, just quiet, like a door closing. Thomas blinked. "Don't tell me what I can afford," she said. "And don't stand there on your dry horse telling me what this animal is worth. You had it. You gave up on it. You don't get to decide what happens to it anymore." There was a silence. The river moved. The horse breathed against her shoulder. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he shrugged, that easy, untouchable shrug of a man who has never lost anything he couldn't replace. "It's your time to waste," he said. He turned his horse. "Come on, boys. We've got fences to check." They rode off, and Jim Aldridge glanced back once, not quite apologetically but close, before he disappeared around the tree line. Abigail stood in the mud with her arms around a dying black horse and the sound of hoofbeats fading in the rain, and she breathed. Then she started walking. She walked that horse the quarter-mile back to her ranch. She stopped every 20 yards to let it rest. She talked the whole way, low and steady, about nothing in particular. She talked about the sky beginning to clear in the west. She talked about the smell of the sage after the rain. She talked about the way the mountains looked in the morning when the light came over them just right, and everything turned gold for about 10 minutes before the day got ordinary again. The horse walked. When they got to the barn, Abigail opened her best stall, the one with the cleanest floor and the best drainage, the one she'd been saving for a good colt. She kept telling herself she'd be able to afford one day. She put the black horse in that stall. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. She dried it. She examined the leg. It wasn't broken, she decided, or not completely. There was damage, but the bone seemed intact, which meant it had a chance. She cleaned the cuts along its sides. She brought feed and water and stayed until the animal stopped trembling. When she finally stepped out of the barn and looked toward the house, the sun was high and she had a full day's work still ahead of her. She stood there for a moment with mud drying on her clothes and exhaustion in every muscle she owned. She thought about Thomas Whitaker's voice. Sentiment doesn't feed anyone through a Montana winter. She thought about her husband Daniel, dead 3 years now, and the way people had looked at her at his funeral. Pitying, worried, already calculating how long she'd last alone. Already deciding, without asking her, that she was the kind of woman who needed saving or needed to leave. She thought about the horse's eyes in the river. That look. "Are you going to walk away like everyone else?" "No," she said out loud, to the empty yard, to nobody. Then she went to do her work. Her name was Abigail May Carter, and before Daniel died, she had been, by most accounts in Willow Creek Valley, a fairly unremarkable woman. Not unremarkable in the way that meant plain or simple. She was sharp, and people who knew her well knew it. But she had spent most of her married life being the kind of woman who stood slightly behind her husband at social gatherings, who managed the household finances with a quiet precision that nobody gave her credit for, who had opinions about land management and cattle breeding that she mostly kept to herself, because Daniel was a good man, but he was also a man of his time. And in 1875 Montana Territory, a wife's opinions about ranching were considered decoration at best. Daniel had died of fever in February of 1875. Fast and terrible, the way fever deaths were. He'd been fine on a Tuesday and buried on a Saturday, and Abigail had stood at the grave in a black dress that was too thin for a Montana February, holding herself very still while the pastor spoke, and the wind came off the mountains like a judgment. She had not cried in front of anyone. People took that as coldness. She knew they did. She'd heard it said, quietly, by women in town. She didn't even weep properly at her own husband's funeral. What do you make of that? What they didn't know, what she hadn't told anyone, was that she'd cried every single night for 4 months after. Alone. In the dark. Into the pillow that still smelled faintly of him for the first few weeks, and then just into fabric. She'd cried until there wasn't anything left to cry, and then she'd gotten up and gone to work. Because the ranch didn't care that she was grieving. The cattle didn't care. The debt didn't care. The world did not pause for widows. She had kept the ranch running by herself for 3 years, hiring seasonal help when she could afford it, doing most of the work herself when she couldn't. 60 acres wasn't much by valley standards. Some of the big ranches around her ran on thousands, but 60 acres was hers, paid for with her and Daniel's savings over 10 years of careful living, and she was not going to lose it. She'd sold cattle when she had to. She'd cut her own expenses to almost nothing. She ate simple food, wore the same clothes until they gave out, and put every extra cent back into the land. People in town were polite to her face and doubtful behind her back. She knew this. She'd overheard things in the dry goods store, at church, at the occasional social gatherings she forced herself to attend because isolation was a slower death than hardship. She won't last another year. Daniel's land'll be for sale by spring, mark my words. She's too proud to ask for help and too stubborn to admit it's beyond her. She heard all of it. She tucked it away in the same place she tucked the loneliness and the fear and the exhaustion, somewhere behind her sternum, where it couldn't slow her hands or her feet. She kept working. But the black horse was something new, something she hadn't planned for, something that didn't fit into the careful math of survival she'd been doing for 3 years. And she couldn't explain, even to herself, exactly why she'd done it. That evening, when the chores were done and the light was going amber and low, she went back to the barn. The horse was standing. That was the first good sign. It had eaten. She could see the hay was disturbed. It watched her come through the door with those enormous dark eyes, wary but not panicked. She moved slowly. She sat down on the stool she kept for milking and just was there, quiet, letting him get used to the fact of her. After about 10 minutes, he shifted his weight, turned his head slightly in her direction. "I know," she said. "I don't know why I did it either." She rested her elbows on her knees and looked at him properly for the first time without the urgency of the rescue clouding everything. Hal was young. Younger than she'd first thought. Probably not yet 4. His coat was deeply, purely black, the kind of black that looked almost blue in certain lights, the kind that caught whatever was around him and made it shine. Under the mud and the damage he'd been through, under the ribs that showed a little too clearly, and the dull coat that told the story of poor feeding and poor care, there was something. She wasn't sure she could name it exactly. A quality. A presence. The way he held himself even now, hurt and scared and exhausted, had something in it that was not defeated. He hadn't given up, even in that river, even when he had every reason to. "Midnight," she said. The horse's ear flicked. "Your name is Midnight," she said, "because you're the darkest thing I've ever pulled out of the water, and because I found you at the worst part of a hard night, and because—" She paused. "Because every dark thing eventually gets to morning, if it holds on long enough." She sat with him until the stars came out. 3 days after the rescue, Samuel Brooks appeared at her fence. Samuel was 70 years old, leather-faced, deliberate in every word and movement, and had spent 20 years in the U.S. Cavalry before he'd come to Montana to retire on 20 acres of mostly rockland that everyone agreed was unsuitable for ranching. He grew a kitchen garden, kept 2 mules, and was widely regarded in the valley as a man who knew more than he said and said more than people wanted to hear. He came to the fence on a gray morning, hands in his coat pockets, and looked at her barn without speaking for a while. "I heard about the horse," he said finally. "I imagine you did," Abigail said. She was mending a section of fence that the storm had pushed sideways. She kept working. "I heard Whitaker's version," Samuel said. "And I heard Morrison's version. I came to hear yours." She told him, plain and simple, what she'd seen, what she'd done, why. Samuel was quiet through all of it. When she finished, he said, "What do you know about horses?" "Enough to keep the 3 I already own alive and working," she said. "What do you know about this kind of horse?" She looked at him. "What kind is that?" Samuel pulled a hand out of his pocket and gestured vaguely at nothing. "The kind with something in him," he said. "The kind that's different from the beginning. You can see it if you know what to look for. Most people don't look." He paused. "Thomas Whitaker doesn't look. He measures." Abigail set down her fence tool. "Are you telling me that horse has value?" "I'm telling you," Samuel said carefully, "that I've seen 3 horses in my life with that particular quality. One was a cavalry horse that carried a colonel through 2 battles with bullets in its shoulder. One was a racing horse out of Kentucky that changed hands for more money than most men earn in a lifetime." He paused again, longer this time. "And one was a horse I personally broke and trained and lost in a card game when I was 27 years old, which is a story I don't tell to anyone. But my point is that I know what I'm looking at." Abigail was quiet. "The leg?" she said. "Show me," Samuel said. She took him into the barn. He examined Midnight the way a doctor examines a patient. Careful, unhurried, thorough. He ran his hands down the injured leg. He watched the horse's eyes. He stood back and just looked for a long time. "It's not broken," he said. "Severely strained. Possible ligament damage. With the right rest, the right treatment, and—" He glanced at her. "Time. Patience. This horse could heal completely. Thomas said he'd never run properly." "Thomas Whitaker," Samuel said, without heat but with absolute precision, "is a man who believes that anything he's given up on is not worth having. It makes him feel better about giving up." He looked at Midnight. "This horse can run. This horse can do more than run, if somebody gives it the chance." Something moved in Abigail's chest. Careful, dangerous, that feeling. The feeling of hope in a place where you'd been working hard to keep things practical. "I don't know enough," she said. "I know horses well enough to manage mine, but this kind of training, this kind of care, I don't have that knowledge." Samuel turned and looked at her. His eyes were the pale, faded blue of old denim, and they were very steady. "No," he said, "but I do." He came every morning after that. 6 in the morning, sometimes earlier, appearing at the barn door with his deliberate stride and his hands in his pockets. He never announced he was coming. He just came. Abigail learned fast. She had always been a quick study. Daniel used to say she only needed to be shown something once, and she threw herself into everything Samuel taught her, with the concentration of someone who understands that knowledge is the only resource that doesn't run out. She learned about how ligament injuries heal differently than bone injuries, and why rest in the early weeks was more important than any treatment. She learned about the relationship between a horse's nutrition and the quality of its muscle development. She learned about the way a horse's trust is built, not through dominance, not through force, but through consistency. Through showing up, every morning, every time. Most people try to train a horse, Samuel told her one afternoon, watching Abigail work with Midnight in the small paddock. They try to make it do what they want. What you're doing is different. What am I doing? Abigail asked. She was walking slowly beside Midnight, matching his pace, not asking anything of him yet. You're convincing him, Samuel said, that the world is safe now, that whatever happened before. He paused. It's over, and what comes next is different. Midnight turned his head and blew softly against her shoulder. Samuel watched this, and something crossed his face that might have been emotion, if Samuel was the kind of man who showed emotion easily. He trusts you already, Samuel said. That's remarkable, for a horse with his history. What is his history? Abigail asked. Hard to know exactly, Samuel said. But from the scarring, from the way he flinched in the early days, I'd say he was trained with fear before Whitaker bought him. Someone used a heavy hand. When he started showing reluctance, when the fear made him unpredictable, Whitaker decided he was defective, turned him loose. Abigail kept walking beside the horse, steady, matching his stride. He's not defective, she said. No, Samuel said. He was just taught the wrong things, by the wrong people. He paused. Most hurt things aren't defective, Mrs. Carter. They're just responding correctly to what was done to them. She looked at the old man standing at the fence. He was looking at the horse, not at her. Samuel, she said, did you ride with the cavalry in the war? Yes, he said. Did you see? She stopped. Never mind. Yes, he said again, quieter. I saw things I don't talk about. I came out here because I needed to be somewhere that moved slowly and didn't smell like gunpowder. He was quiet for a moment. I never trusted people easily after that. But horses... He shook his head slightly. Horses don't lie to you. They don't pretend. What they are is what they show you. There's a relief in that after a while. Abigail nodded. She understood that. The months moved forward. Montana spring came slow and cold, and then all at once, warm and sudden, the way it always did. Midnight's leg healed. It healed better than Abigail had let herself hope. By April, he was moving without a limp. By May, he was moving freely. By June, when she first let him run in the open field, she stood at the fence and watched him and felt something she didn't have a word for. He ran like something had been waiting in him all along. Like the ground was just a courtesy, and what he really wanted was the air above it. His stride was long and even and fast, deeply fast, and he moved with a fluid intelligence that made the other horses in her pasture look mechanical by comparison. Lord, she said softly. Samuel stood beside her. He said nothing for a long time. I've seen 3 horses, he said finally. I know, she said. He's the 4th, Samuel said. He's better than all 3. The word got out slowly, the way word always gets out in small communities. Not from any announcement Abigail made, but from eyes at fences, from travelers on the road who happened to see a black horse moving in a field and stopped to look a little longer than they meant to. From the feed store conversations that happen when people are picking up their orders and someone mentions something they noticed. Within 6 months of that morning in the river, people were stopping on the road outside Abigail's fence. Not to help, not to apologize, just to look. She noticed them and said nothing. Let them look. It was Cal Morrison who came to her first. He came to her store counter in September, on a day when she was picking up a small order, and he cleared his throat in a way that suggested he'd been preparing what he was about to say for some time. That black horse, he said. Yes, she said. I've had 3 men ask me this week if I knew who owned it, Cal said. He looked slightly uncomfortable. Men passing through, not valley people. They saw it from the road. What did you tell them? Abigail asked. I told them it belonged to Abigail Carter, Cal said. And they asked me. He stopped. They asked me who she was. Abigail looked at him. And what did you say? Cal Morrison had the grace to look embarrassed. I said you were a widow woman who'd ranched alone for 3 years. That's accurate, Abigail said pleasantly. One of them, fellow from out of Billings, said he'd heard about a black horse in this valley, and he was looking for a breeding opportunity. Cal looked at her carefully. He mentioned a figure. He said the figure. Abigail kept her face very still. That figure was more money than she had seen in 3 years combined. I told him I'd pass it along, Cal said. You can tell him the horse isn't for sale, Abigail said, but I'm willing to discuss other arrangements. Cal blinked. What kind of arrangements? She looked at him with the calm, steady gaze of a woman who had spent 3 years learning to know what she knew. The kind I decide, she said. Thank you, Cal. She picked up her order and left. The offer from Thomas Whitaker came 2 weeks later. He rode to her gate himself, which told her he considered this a serious matter. Thomas Whitaker did not personally ride to anyone's gate for small matters. He was dressed well, as always. He took off his hat when she came out of the house, which was a courtesy she noted. Abigail, he said, I'll get straight to the point. Please, she said. I'll give you $200 for the black horse, he said. $200. 6 months ago, that number would have made her hands shake. She'd spent most of those 6 months not knowing if she'd make it to spring. $200 would have felt like salvation. She looked at Thomas Whitaker on his horse. She thought about the river, the mud, his voice. That's sentiment. And sentiment doesn't feed anyone through a Montana winter. She thought about midnight running in the field, that stride, that particular quality of movement, Samuel's voice. He's better than all three. She thought about the man from Billings and the figure Cal Morrison had mentioned. No, she said. Thomas blinked, just slightly. He was not a man who heard that word often. Abigail, he said, that is a generous offer for an animal with a history of— You told me he'd never run properly, she said. A pause. I may have been overly pessimistic, Thomas said carefully. You were wrong, she said. And you knew what you had and you gave up on it. I didn't know what I had, and I chose to save it anyway. She looked at him levelly. That distinction matters, Mr. Whitaker. At least to me. Something moved in his face. She couldn't quite name it. It wasn't anger. It might have been, briefly, respect. It disappeared quickly. Name your price then, he said. He's not for sale, she said. Everything is for sale, Abigail. Not everything, she said. Not to you. She looked at him steadily. The day you left that horse in that river, you decided you knew his value. You decided he wasn't worth your time or your effort or your belief. He's mine now, and I'll decide what he's worth from here. Thomas Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. The morning was very quiet. A hawk crossed the sky above them. You're making a mistake, he said. But his voice had changed slightly. The certainty had dropped out of it. Just slightly. Just enough. I've made plenty, Abigail said. But not this one. He put his hat back on. He rode away. And Abigail Carter stood at her gate in the Montana morning, watching the most powerful man in Willow Creek Valley ride off her property. And she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Like someone who knows exactly what she's doing. Like someone who is not going anywhere. Like someone who has only just begun. The winter of 1878 came early, and it came mean. By October, the temperature had already dropped below what any old-timer in Willow Creek Valley called reasonable. By November, the snow was so deep that Abigail was waking up at 4 in the morning just to make sure the barn roof hadn't caved in overnight. By December, 3 ranches on the south side of the valley had already sold their cattle at a loss, and 2 families had packed their wagons and left for somewhere warmer and easier. Nobody left quietly. They came through town first, and when they came through town they talked, and what they talked about mostly was how bad things were and how much worse they were going to get. Abigail heard all of it. She always heard all of it. Small towns in the Montana Territory were like that. The gossip moved faster than the weather and almost as coldly. What she heard that December, in the feed store and at the church social and from Cal Morrison's counter, was this: Thomas Whitaker was buying. Every family that left, every ranch that sold in distress, Thomas Whitaker was there. Ready. With cash and a fair face and a purchase price that was low enough to be an insult, but high enough that desperate people took it, because desperate people don't have the luxury of pride. He had bought 3 properties by Christmas. He was in negotiation for 2 more. He's doing it again, Samuel told her one morning, sitting on the overturned bucket he used as a stool when he came to the barn. Same thing he did in 71. Waits for the hard years, and then he moves. By spring, he'll own half the South Valley. What happened in 71? Abigail asked. She was working on Midnight's hooves, calm and methodical, and Midnight was standing still for her the way he always did now. Completely still, completely trusting, the way he'd never stood for anyone else. 7 families lost their land, Samuel said. He bought all of it. Some of those families had been here since the territory opened. He paused. The Hendersons were one. You know the Henderson place? That big spread on the river road? I know it, Abigail said. That was a family place, Samuel said. 3 generations built it. Whitaker bought it for 12 cents on the dollar in February of 71, and the Henderson family was in Kansas by April. He was quiet for a moment. He's not a cruel man, Thomas Whitaker. He doesn't enjoy other people's pain. He just doesn't let it get in the way of business. Which is almost worse, Abigail said. Almost, Samuel agreed. She stood up and looked at Midnight. He turned his head and pressed his muzzle briefly against her arm, that gesture he'd developed somewhere in the last few months, half greeting, half check, as if confirming she was still there. He's going to come for me eventually, she said. It wasn't a question. Samuel looked at her. Yes, he said. He will. Then we need to be ready, she said. Samuel's pale eyes studied her for a moment. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Abigail said slowly, that the one thing Thomas Whitaker cannot buy is something that has already proven itself to be worth more than he's willing to pay. She looked at Midnight. So we need to prove it. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The territorial spring race, in Billings, May. Yes, she said. That's 5 months away, Samuel said. And Midnight has never been in a competitive race. He's never been around that many horses, that much noise, that level of... Can he win? Abigail asked. Samuel stopped. He looked at the horse. He looked for a long time. Yes, he said. I believe he can win. Then that's what we're doing, Abigail said. That was the thing about decisions made in cold barns in Montana winters. They tended to be clean. No ceremony, no hesitation. Just the facts of what was needed and the will to go toward it. She started training Midnight the next morning. What she didn't know yet was that Thomas Whitaker was also entering a horse in the territorial spring race, and that his horse had won the previous 2 years, and that he had spent the better part of $3,000 developing it. She found that out 2 weeks later from Jim Aldridge, of all people, who came to her fence on a Tuesday with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who wasn't quite sure why he'd come, but had come anyway. Jim, she said, surprised. Mrs. Carter, he said. He twisted the hat brim. I wanted to... He stopped, started again. I was there, at the river, in August. I remember, she said. I should have said something, Jim said. When Thomas was talking to you like that, I should have said something and I didn't. He looked down at his hat. I'm not proud of that. Abigail studied him. Jim Aldridge was not a bad man. She'd always known that. He was a man who defaulted to the strongest current in the room, which in Willow Creek Valley almost always meant Thomas Whitaker. But he wasn't bad. What brings you here now, Jim? She asked. He looked up. I heard you're putting Midnight in the territorial race. News travels, she said. Thomas heard it too, Jim said. He paused. He's not happy, Mrs. Carter. He's talking about it in ways I don't like. About your horse. About you. Something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. What's he saying? Jim looked genuinely uncomfortable. He's saying the horse won't qualify, that you don't have the registration paperwork because the horse was abandoned and you have no bill of sale, no lineage records, nothing to prove provenance. He met her eyes. He's right that you don't have those things, and without them, the race committee won't register midnight. Abigail was very still. She hadn't thought about the paperwork. She had been so focused on the training, on the horse, on the physical reality of what she was building, that she hadn't thought about the bureaucratic machinery that surrounded it. "Can he block the registration?" she asked. "He's on the race committee," Jim said quietly. "He's been on it for 6 years." The cold feeling deepened. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Jim Aldridge was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hat. Then he looked at her. "Because I was there at the river," he said again. "And I didn't say anything then. And maybe—" He stopped. "Maybe I'm trying to say something now." She looked at him for a long time. "Thomas abandoned that horse," she said. "His abandonment is documented. If he gave it up, walked away, left it on that riverbank, then the animal has no registered owner, which means I can register it myself." Jim blinked. "Can you do that?" "I don't know," she said. "I need to find out." She paused. "Do you know a lawyer, Jim? Someone not connected to Thomas Whitaker?" Jim thought for a moment. "There's a fellow in Billings, Robert Hadley. He handled my father's estate. He's not in Thomas's pocket." "Can you write me an introduction?" Abigail asked. Jim Aldridge looked at her with something that might have been the first real respect he'd ever shown her. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." He left, and Abigail went inside and sat at her kitchen table for 10 minutes without moving, working through everything in her head. Then she got up, got her coat, and went back to the barn. Because the horses still needed feeding, and the work didn't stop because the problems got harder. That was something she'd learned too. The work was always the answer. Not because it solved everything, but because it kept you moving forward while you figured out what to solve first. She trained midnight that evening until the stars came out, and he ran for her like something that had always known it was going to be asked to fly. The trip to Billings took 2 days each way, in January, which was not a reasonable time to travel 2 days through Montana, but she had no choice about the timing. She left her ranch in the care of a teenage neighbor boy named Eli Hatch, who she trusted because he was quiet and responsible, and because she had no other options. Robert Hadley turned out to be a compact, precise man in his 50s, with round spectacles and the manner of someone who had spent decades watching people underestimate him, and had decided to find it amusing rather than offensive. He listened to her entire story without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the notes he'd made. "You have no bill of sale," he said. "No." "No registration papers?" "No." "The horse was pulled from a river, from public land, after being turned loose, effectively abandoned, by its registered owner?" "Yes." "And the previous registered owner is Thomas Whitaker?" "Yes." Hadley set down his pen. "Thomas Whitaker is going to argue that abandonment doesn't constitute transfer of ownership, that he could have returned for the horse at any time. He told me directly, in front of witnesses, that it was a lost cause and my time to waste," Abigail said. Those were his exact words. Hadley looked at her. "Who were the witnesses?" "Jim Aldridge, Pete Aldridge, Cal Morrison." "Morrison?" Hadley raised an eyebrow. "The feed store owner?" "Yes." Hadley picked up his pen again. "Are any of those men willing to testify to what they heard?" "Jim Aldridge introduced me to you," Abigail said. "I believe he might be willing." Hadley nodded slowly. He wrote something. Then he looked up. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I'm going to be direct with you." "Please," she said. "Thomas Whitaker has influence with the Territorial Race Committee. If this goes to a formal dispute, it will take time, possibly more time than you have before the May race." He paused. "However, Montana Territory has clear statutes regarding abandoned property, including livestock. If I can document the abandonment properly, witnesses, timeline, condition of the animal, we can file a claim of ownership that will be very difficult to challenge." How long? She asked. 6 weeks, he said. If the witnesses cooperate. If Whitaker doesn't lawyer up faster than we do. He looked at her steadily. He will lawyer up, Mrs. Carter. You should know that. How much will this cost? She asked. He named a figure. It was not small. It was, in fact, roughly equal to the amount she had managed to save in the last 6 months, which was the entirety of her reserves. She looked at him across the desk. Start the paperwork, she said. She rode back to Willow Creek Valley in the February cold with an empty savings account and a lawyer's handshake, and the strange, frightening lightness of someone who has put everything on one bet. She hadn't told Samuel yet. She told him the morning after she got back, in the barn, while she worked. He listened without speaking. When she finished, he said, "You spent your reserve?" "Yes," she said. "All of it." "Yes." Howe was quiet for a long moment. "If Hadley can't get the registration through by April—" "He will," she said. "Abigail." Samuel's voice was careful, gentle, the voice he used when he was about to say something she didn't want to hear. "If the registration fails, we lose the race entry. If we lose the race entry, we've spent your entire reserve and Midnight still can't race. Whitaker will know that. He'll know you're stretched thin, and then—" "I know," she said. "Do you?" he said. "Because if Whitaker comes with an offer in the spring, and you're out of money, and the horse can't prove his value because we couldn't get him registered—" "Samuel." She stopped working and looked at him. "I know the risk. I went to Billings because I knew the risk, and I went anyway." She held his gaze. "Do you believe in that horse?" Samuel looked at Midnight. "Yes," he said quietly. "Then help me get him ready," she said. "Leave the paperwork to Hadley. You worry about the horse. I'll worry about the rest." Samuel studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded, once. They went to work. The weeks that followed were the hardest she could remember, and she'd had some hard weeks to compare them against. She was training Midnight in the brutal Montana cold, running him carefully, building endurance without burning out his joints, managing the injury history in his leg with a precision she'd learned from Samuel and reinforced by reading everything she could find in the small territorial library in town. She was managing her regular ranch operations on almost no reserves, cutting every expense she possibly could, eating simpler food than she already ate, which she hadn't thought possible. She was waiting for word from Hadley and Billings, watching the weeks count down toward May, and she was watching Thomas Whitaker. He was watching her too. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming, not from seeing it directly, but from the way everything around you shifts slightly, the way animals get restless, the way the air changes. In February, her water trough was found damaged, broken at the base, water frozen into a sheet across the yard. It could have been weather. It could have been something else. She fixed it herself, in the cold, and said nothing to anyone. In March, a fence section on the east side of her property was found cut. Clean cut, not broken by weather. She fixed that too. She told Samuel, who nodded slowly and said nothing, but started coming earlier in the mornings. In late March, Thomas Whitaker came to her gate again. He came alone this time. No audience. He pulled up to the fence on a cold Thursday morning and looked at her with the expression of a man who is genuinely trying to be reasonable. "I want to buy the horse, Abigail," he said. "Not for $200. I know that was too low. I'll give you $800. $800. Her mind did the arithmetic automatically. $800 would pay off her feed debts, replace the roof section that had been failing since fall, and give her enough reserve to get through another year without the kind of desperation she'd been living in for the past 3 months. She looked at Thomas Whitaker. She thought about the cut fence. She thought about the water trough. She thought about the Hendersons, who had been in this valley for 3 generations and were now in Kansas. "Are you the one cutting my fences?" she asked. Thomas's expression didn't change. That was, she thought, itself an answer. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "I didn't accuse anyone," she said. "I asked a question." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, $800, Abigail. That's a fair price. More than fair." "You're afraid of him," she said. Something shifted in Thomas's face. "I beg your pardon?" "You're afraid of my horse," she said. "You came to offer me 200 in October, and I said no, and you thought I'd break over winter. And I didn't break. And now it's March, and the race is in May, and you're offering 800, which is 4 times what you offered 5 months ago. And the only reason a man like you offers 4 times the original price is because he's scared." Thomas Whitaker looked at her. For the first time since she'd known him, she saw something real cross his face. Not the careful performance of reason, not the pleasant smile over the refusal to lose. Something actually real. "I have worked for 30 years to build what I have in this valley," he said. "I have earned everything I own." "I'm not arguing that," Abigail said. "I entered that race in good faith," he said. "I have a horse that has won 2 years running. I have invested, and you're afraid a widow woman on 60 acres is going to beat you," she said. The silence was total. Thomas put his hat back on. "You are making this very difficult." "No, I'm not," Abigail said. "I'm making it simple. The horse isn't for sale. I'm entering him in the race, and whatever happens in May, it will happen honestly." She looked at him steadily. "Which means you should stop having my fences cut. Because if it happens again, I will get lawyers involved, and I have one in Billings already, and I imagine he'd be very interested in the timing." Thomas Whitaker stared at her. Then he turned his horse and rode away. She stood at the fence until he disappeared. Her hands were shaking. She realized she'd been holding them very still at her sides the entire time he was at the gate, and now that the tension broke, they shook, just slightly, and she made fists and breathed. Then she went inside and wrote a letter to Robert Hadley, telling him to move as fast as he could. The letter from Hadley came the 2nd week of April. She was in the barn when Eli Hatch brought it to her from the mail drop in town, and she took it with hands that were steady, only because she'd been standing with Midnight's head against her shoulder, and the animal's calm had transferred to her the way it sometimes did. She opened it. She read it. She read it again. She set the letter down on the hay bale beside her. She put her forehead against Midnight's neck and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. The registration had gone through. By a narrow argument. By Hadley's careful documentation of Thomas Whitaker's explicit and witnessed abandonment of the animal. By Jim Aldridge's written statement, which had apparently been considerably more detailed and unambiguous than she'd expected. And by a provision in territorial livestock law that Hadley had found, and that Thomas Whitaker's lawyer had apparently not anticipated. The ownership of one black stallion, origin unknown, currently in the care of Abigail May Carter of Willow Creek Valley, had been legally established. His name was on paper now. Midnight Carter. She read those 2 words 3 times and then pressed her face against the horse's neck again. "You're official," she said. Her voice was muffled in his mane. "You're officially mine. They can't take you now." Midnight breathed against her shoulder. Samuel arrived 20 minutes later. She hadn't even sent for him. He just came the way he always came, as if he could sense when he was needed. And she handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. He read it slowly, the way Samuel read everything, carefully, 1 word at a time. When he finished, he folded it and handed it back to her. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "Then we'd better be ready to win," he said. He turned toward the paddock, and Abigail felt something break open in her chest. Not grief, not the kind of breaking that had been happening for 3 years, but a different kind. The kind that comes when something that has been held too tight finally gets to expand. She didn't cry. She wasn't a woman who cried easily, not outside the privacy of dark rooms and late nights. But she felt something that was close to it, and she let herself feel it for 30 seconds, standing in the barn with the registration letter in her hand and the smell of hay and horse and cold Montana air all around her. And then she tucked it away. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And she was, as she had told Thomas Whitaker in October, not going anywhere. The final weeks before the race were a different kind of hard than everything that had come before. The weather began to break. Montana springs were still cold, but the brutality of January and February lifted, and the mornings were sharp and clean instead of brutal, and Midnight moved through them like he was discovering something new about himself every day. Samuel pushed them both, Harder than before, but smarter. He understood exactly where the edge was, and he kept them just beneath it. Building speed without burning endurance. Building endurance without breaking spirit. "He's ready," Samuel told her 10 days before they were scheduled to leave for Billings. "Are you sure?" she asked. "No," Samuel said. "Nobody's sure of anything with horses. That's what makes it honest." He paused. "But he's the best I've ever prepared. And I've prepared a great many horses in my life." She looked at Midnight in the paddock. He was standing with his head up, watching something on the horizon. A hawk, a cloud, something she couldn't see. His coat had deepened over the winter, developed the kind of shine that only comes from health that goes bone deep. He looked like what he was, an animal in the absolute peak of what he could be. "Samuel," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "Why did you come to my fence that morning, after the rescue? Why did you come to help me?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means someone is deciding how honest to be. "I saw you pull him out of that river," he said. She looked at him. "You were there?" "I was on the road," he said. "I'd been out early. I saw you go into that water." He paused. "I've watched a lot of people in my life make choices about hard things. Most people walk away. Most people do the calculation and they decide it's not worth the cost." He looked at Midnight. "You didn't do the calculation. You just went in." "That might have been stupidity," she said. "It might have been," Samuel agreed. "But it looked like something else." He paused. "I haven't had reason to put my knowledge to use in a long time, Mrs. Carter. I was—" He stopped. Started again. "I was going a bit to seed, if I'm honest. Sitting on 20 acres of rocks and telling myself I was content." She waited. "Watching what you've done this year," he said slowly. "With that horse, with your land, with your stubbornness." There was something warm in his voice when he said the word. "Has been the most useful I've felt in a decade." He looked at her. "So I suppose the answer to your question is that you went into that river and I thought, that woman is going to need help. And I happened to have exactly the kind of help she needed. And there are not many moments in a life when those two things line up that neatly." Abigail looked at the old cavalryman standing at her fence. "Thank you, Samuel," she said. "Don't thank me until after the race," he said. But the warmth was still there in his voice. Word had spread through Willow Creek Valley, the way news always spread there, fast and not entirely accurately. What people knew was that Abigail Carter was taking her black horse to the territorial race in Billings. What people believed varied considerably depending on who was talking. Thomas Whitaker's crowd believed she was going to embarrass herself. She had no experience with competitive racing. Her horse had an injury history that couldn't be fully concealed, and the horse she was going up against, Thomas's gray stallion, General, who had won the race 2 years running, was an established, documented champion with professional preparation behind him. The other crowd, smaller, quieter, the people who had been watching from the roadside fence all winter, believed something different. They weren't sure what to call it. Some of them just said Midnight was something special. Some of them said Abigail Carter was something special. Some of them said both. 2 days before she was to leave for Billings, 3 women from the valley came to her gate. She didn't know them well. They were ranchers' wives, women she saw at church and nodded to, women whose husbands moved in different circles than anyone who ever spoke to her directly. Their leader, if she could be called that, was a woman named May Thornton, who was 60 years old, built like someone who had spent 40 of those years doing hard physical work, and had eyes that had seen enough of the world to be very quiet about most of it. May Thornton stood at Abigail's gate and said, "We came to wish you well." Abigail blinked. "Thank you," she said carefully. "And to give you this," May said, and held out an envelope. Abigail took it and opened it. Inside was a folded collection of bills, not a fortune, not anything close to what the race would mean, but real money, carefully assembled. She looked up. "I can't take this." "You can and you will," May Thornton said. "That's for your travel expenses. So you don't go to Billings on a shoestring and worry about the cost of the hotel while you're trying to win a race." Abigail stared at her. "Mrs. Thornton, there are 12 families in this valley. May Thornton said, who have watched Thomas Whitaker buy up land for 15 years every time things get hard. And most of us have never done a thing about it because it seemed like the kind of thing that was just the way things were. She paused. And then you pulled a dying horse out of a river and spent a year proving everyone wrong about what it was worth. She looked at Abigail with those quiet, seen-everything eyes. We want someone to go to Billings and win, Mrs. Carter, and we believe you're the one. Abigail held the envelope. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent in this valley being the woman people didn't see. Being the widow who everyone had already decided would fail. Being the one they talked about at the feed counter. She thought about all the times she'd wanted someone to see her, really see her, and had made herself stop wanting it because wanting it hurt, and she had too much else to manage. She looked at May Thornton. I'm going to try my best, she said. We know you are, May said. That's why we came. They left, and Abigail stood at her gate with the envelope in her hand and the spring Montana sky going wide and blue above her. She breathed. Then she went to find Samuel, because they had 2 more days of training before the trip to Billings, and Midnight's best work was always done in the early morning. And the early morning came fast, and she had never yet wasted one. The road to Billings took 2 days, and Abigail spent most of both of them talking to Midnight. Samuel rode beside her in the wagon, quiet in the way he was always quiet, present, watchful, saying things only when they needed saying. Midnight was tethered behind, and every few miles Abigail would turn to check on him, and every time she turned, he was there, moving steadily, his black coat catching whatever light was available and giving it back differently. She talked to him about the valley, about the way it would look when they got back, about the wells she was planning to dig in the south pasture if the money from the race allowed it, about the breeding program she'd been sketching in the margins of Samuel's old cavalry manuals, careful, methodical notes about bloodlines and endurance, and the kind of stock that could actually survive a Montana winter without losing condition. She didn't talk about losing. She didn't talk about Thomas Whitaker, whose own wagon they had passed on the first morning, going the same road, with his gray stallion General in a proper horse trailer behind it, and 2 hired men riding alongside. Thomas had nodded at her from his wagon seat. She had nodded back. Neither of them had stopped. Samuel had watched the exchange without comment. It was only that evening, when they'd made camp and Midnight was settled and fed and the fire was going, that Samuel said anything about it. He's nervous, Samuel said. Abigail looked up from the coffee she was making. Thomas? He nodded to you, Samuel said. Thomas Whitaker does not nod to people he's not worried about. She thought about that. Or he was being polite. Thomas Whitaker is polite to people who have something he wants, Samuel said. Or people who could take something from him. He looked at the fire. You've become both. She sat with that for a moment. Is General as good as his reputation? She asked. Samuel was quiet long enough that she knew the answer wasn't simple. General is a very good horse, he said carefully. He's well-trained, well-maintained, consistent. He's won this race 2 years because he's reliable. He doesn't make mistakes. And Midnight? She said. Samuel looked at the dark shape of the horse standing at the edge of the firelight. Midnight is not reliable in the way General is reliable, he said. He's something else. He's... Samuel paused, searching for the right word. Midnight runs like it means something to him, like he understands what he's doing, and he chooses to do it. He shook his head slightly. I've trained many horses. I've never said that about one before. Is that enough to win? Abigail asked. Samuel looked at her across the fire. I don't know, he said honestly. But I know it's the most I've ever put in a race. She nodded. She drank her coffee. The night was cold and clear, and very big the way Montana nights were. All that sky pressing down on everything and making the world feel both small and immense at the same time. Samuel, she said. If we lose. Don't, he said. I need to think about it, she said. I need to think about what I'd do if we lose. He was quiet. If we lose, she said, Midnight still has his registration. He still has his bloodline, whatever it is. He still has what he is. She paused. There are breeding opportunities. There's a man in Billings, the one Cal Morrison mentioned. There are other races. It doesn't have to end at one loss." Samuel looked at the fire. "No," he said, "it doesn't. But the valley will read a loss as the end," she said. "Thomas will use it. He'll come with an offer the week after we get back, and half the people who gave May Thornton money for my travel expenses will think they bet wrong." "Some of them," Samuel said. "Most of them," she said. She wasn't being bitter, just accurate. "Then we'd better win," Samuel said. She almost laughed. "That's your advice? Just win?" "It's the clearest advice I have," he said. And there was something in his voice that was almost a smile. "Go to sleep, Abigail. He runs better when you're rested." She lay down wrapped in her blankets with the fire going low and the horses breathing steadily nearby, and she didn't sleep for a long time. She wasn't thinking about winning or losing. She was thinking about that morning on the riverbank, 9 months ago, when she'd walked into the cold water without thinking. When she hadn't done the calculation. When she'd just gone in. She wondered sometimes if that moment was what her whole life had been building toward. Not the ranch, not the debt, not the 3 years of trying to prove she could survive alone, but that specific moment of choosing not to walk away. She fell asleep thinking about water and cold and the weight of an animal that was still fighting. Billings was larger than Willow Creek Valley by enough to be briefly overwhelming. The streets were busier, the noise was more constant, the air smelled of industry and horses, and the particular energy of a place that hadn't yet decided what it was going to become. The territorial spring race was one of the largest events of the year, and the town had the feel of somewhere that knew it was being watched. They found the registration office without trouble. Hadley's paperwork had preceded them, sent ahead by post. And Abigail completed midnight's formal race registration at a narrow desk staffed by a young clerk who looked at her with mild surprise, and then at midnight, tethered outside the window, with considerably more interest. "That your horse, ma'am?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at midnight for another long moment. "He's something," he said, with the tone of someone not trying to give a compliment, but unable to help it. "Yes," she said. "He is." The problem started an hour later. She was settling midnight into the stable, the race organization provided for participants, when a man came into the stall area and stood watching her with the particular posture of someone who has been sent somewhere rather than choosing to come. He was young, maybe 30, and he wore the look of a man who was uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "Mrs. Carter?" he said. "Yes," she said. She kept working, not stopping. "My name is Davis. I'm assistant to Chairman Reeves of the race committee." He paused. "There's a situation regarding your horse's registration." Abigail's hands went still. She made them move again. "What kind of situation?" "A formal objection has been filed," Davis said, "against Midnight's eligibility, on the grounds that his ownership history is contested." She turned around. "By whom?" she said. Davis looked deeply uncomfortable. "I'm not at liberty to." "Thomas Whitaker," she said. Davis said nothing, which was itself an answer. "When did this objection come in?" she said. "This morning," Davis said, "before you arrived." He had been moving before she had. She should have expected that. She'd known Thomas was coming the same road. He'd had the same travel time she did. He'd come straight to the committee the moment he arrived. "There will be a hearing," Davis said, "tomorrow morning, before the race." "The race is at noon," Abigail said. "The hearing is at 8, Davis said. "You'll have the opportunity to present your documentation and your case." He paused. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Carter. I don't—" He stopped. "I'm just the messenger." "I know," she said. She looked at him. "I was genuinely uncomfortable." She made herself be kind. "Thank you for telling me directly." He left, and she stood in the stall with her hand on Midnight's neck and her mind moving very fast. She needed Hadley. She needed him here, in Billings, tomorrow morning at 8, with every document he had filed, and every piece of correspondence, and Jim Aldridge's written statement, and every single thing that supported her case. She needed him in the next, she calculated, 15 hours. She found a telegraph office 3 streets over and sent a message to Hadley's office. Then she went back to Samuel and told him what had happened, standing in the street with the noise of Billings around them, and watched his face go through several things in quick succession. "He filed before we even arrived," Samuel said. "Yes." Samuel's jaw tightened. "That's not a man who's worried about fair competition," he said. "That's a man who's trying to prevent competition entirely." "I know," she said. "If the committee rules against your registration—" "They won't," she said. "Abigail, they won't," she said again, and her voice had that quality it sometimes got. Not loud, not forceful, but certain in a way that was harder to argue with than volume. Hadley did this correctly. The documentation is solid. Jim's statement is solid. The territorial statute is clear. She looked at Samuel. Thomas can file all the objections he wants. He can't manufacture documents that don't exist. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "You're not scared," he said. "I'm terrified," she said. "But being terrified and being right aren't mutually exclusive." Samuel looked at her, and something in his expression settled into the particular quality it had when he was decided about something. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Take care of midnight tonight," she said. "I'm going to be up until I hear from Hadley." Hadley's reply came at 10 o'clock that evening, brought to her by a telegraph boy who found her at the hotel where she'd taken the cheapest room available. The message was brief, in the way Hadley was brief when brevity would do. Documents in order. Arriving 7 a.m. Whitaker's objection has no legal standing. Hold firm. She read it twice. Then she slept. Not well, but enough. Hadley arrived at 6:55 the next morning, traveling through the night, looking like a man who had done exactly that, but was not complaining about it. He had a leather case under his arm and the expression of someone who had been looking forward to this fight. "He hired Garrison," Hadley told her, without preamble, as they walked to the committee building. "Garrison is the best property lawyer in the territory. Whitaker is not playing casually." "Neither are we," Abigail said. Hadley looked at her sideways. "No," he said. "We are not." The committee room was small and contained 5 men behind a long table, with Thomas Whitaker on one side and Abigail on the other, and a man named Garrison, who was exactly what Hadley had described, polished, precise, and clearly very good at his job, sitting at Thomas's elbow. Thomas himself looked at Abigail when she came in, and she held his gaze, and neither of them looked away for a long moment before the committee chairman called things to order. "We have a formal objection to the eligibility of the horse registered as Midnight Carter," Chairman Reeves said. He was a gray-haired man with the air of someone who would rather be literally anywhere else. "Mr. Garrison, please present your client's objection." Garrison stood. He was smooth and clean in his delivery. She would give him that. He laid out Thomas's case efficiently. That the horse had been Thomas Whitaker's registered property, that abandonment under duress, specifically a storm event, did not legally constitute transfer of ownership, that Mrs. Carter had no bill of sale, no documented transfer, and that her claim of ownership was therefore insufficient for race eligibility. He sat down. Hadley stood, and Robert Hadley, in his compact, precise, spectacled way, proceeded to dismantle Garrison's argument so methodically and so completely that by the end of it, one of the committee members was suppressing what looked like the beginning of a smile. Hadley had the territorial statute. He had Thomas Whitaker's own words, documented in Jim Aldridge's signed and notarized statement. "I gave it a clean field and an open gate. What it does after that is its own business. It's your time to waste." He had the timeline. He had the medical documentation of the animal's condition at rescue, prepared by the veterinarian she'd had examine Midnight in January, proving the horse had been in a state of severe distress constituting abandonment, not temporary separation. I had everything. Garrison tried twice to redirect. Hadley answered both attempts without raising his voice. Thomas Whitaker sat very still through all of it. His face was controlled, but she was watching his hands, and his hands told a different story. The committee deliberated for 22 minutes. They came back, and Chairman Reeves said, "The objection is denied. Midnight Carter's registration stands. The race proceeds as scheduled." Abigail sat very still for a moment. Then she stood up. Thomas was already standing, and for a moment they were facing each other across the room, just the two of them, with the committee filing out and Hadley and Garrison gathering their papers. Thomas Whitaker looked at her. "You're good," he said, quietly, without the pleasant performance, just direct. "I had help," she said, equally direct. "You have more than I gave you credit for," he said. "Most people do," she said. He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he picked up his hat and left. Hadley squeezed her arm briefly as he passed. "Go win your race, Mrs. Carter," he said. She walked out into the Billings morning with 3 hours until noon. She went straight to the stable. Midnight was awake when she arrived, already restless with the energy of the day. Horses knew things. She'd learned that in the past year. They knew when something was happening even before the humans around them did. He was moving in his stall, not frantically, but with the alert, coiled quality she'd come to recognize as his race energy, his version of being ready. Samuel was there already. Of course he was. "Well," Samuel said, looking up. "We race," she said. Something crossed Samuel's face that took her a moment to identify. Relief. Actual relief, which meant he'd been more worried than he'd shown. "Then let's get him ready," Samuel said. The 2 hours before the race were a kind of controlled quiet that Abigail would remember for the rest of her life. She and Samuel worked in near silence, preparing Midnight with the same careful routine they'd developed over months of mornings in her Montana barn. Every gesture was familiar. Every moment was something they'd done before. And Midnight responded to that familiarity the way he always did, with trust, with stillness underneath the energy. She talked to him the whole time, low, steady. "This is just another morning," she told him. "This is just us. You know what to do. I know you do." Around her, she was aware of the other horses being prepared in neighboring stalls. 8 horses in total were running the race. She didn't look at General. Thomas's gray stallion, in the stall 3 down, being worked over by 2 professional handlers who moved with the efficiency of people who had done this many times. She focused on Midnight. Other riders were talking, laughing, performing the social ritual of pre-race confidence. The jockey Thomas had hired for General was a small, weathered man named Cord, who had ridden in territorial races for 15 years and had the detached calm of someone who had won and lost enough times to stop being emotional about either. Abigail was riding Midnight herself. This had been a point of significant discussion between her and Samuel. "You're not a race jockey," Samuel had said, back in Montana, when she'd first stated her intention. "No," she'd agreed. "But I'm the one he trusts." Samuel had argued it. Reasonably. A lighter rider would help. An experienced jockey would know the race tactics, the positioning, when to hold and when to push. And she had listened to all of it, and then said, "Samuel, you told me yourself that Midnight is different. That he runs like it means something to him. He runs for me. If I put a stranger on his back for the most important race of his life, what happens to that?" Samuel had gone quiet. Then he'd said, "You'll have to hold him at the start. He'll want to run too early. Wait for the second quarter. Let them tire slightly. Then ask him." "I know," she'd said. "You need to trust what you've built," Samuel said. "Not just him. You. What you know." "I know," she said again. Now, in the Billings stable with an hour to the race, Samuel came and stood beside her and said it one more time, quietly, just for her. "Trust what you've built," he said. She nodded. The race course ran 2 miles on the flat ground east of town, with a wide starting line and enough room for 8 horses abreast. The crowd was substantial. More people than she'd seen assembled in one place in years, pressed along both sides of the course, noisy and alive with the anticipatory energy of people who had come to watch something happen. She rode Midnight to the starting line and felt him beneath her, that coiled spring readiness, the barely contained quality of everything he was. She kept her hands light, kept her voice low, kept herself calm, because he would read her. He always read her, and whatever she was feeling would become what he was feeling. Thomas Whitaker stood at the rail near the start. She saw him as she positioned Midnight. He was watching General, not her. His face was the face of a man who was entirely focused on what was in front of him. Cord, the jockey on General, glanced at her once. A professional assessment. She could see him calculating her. Widow woman, no racing experience, big black horse, and reaching conclusions. She didn't try to change his conclusions. Let him think what he thought. The starter raised his flag. Midnight shifted beneath her. She felt the shift go all the way through her own body. "Easy," she murmured. "Not yet. Not yet." The flag dropped. 8 horses launched from the line in a burst of sound and motion and churned earth. General went to the front immediately, Cord taking him there with practiced ease, setting the pace, exactly the move of a horse and rider who knew what they were doing. 2 other horses pushed up beside him, competitive, aggressive. The crowd roared. Abigail held Midnight back, not far back. 4th position, breathing room, watching. He fought her slightly, wanting to push forward, wanting to go. She held him. Steady pressure, not fear, not restraint. Just wait. She could feel his impatience like a physical thing. She understood it. She felt it too. But she heard Samuel's voice. Wait for the second quarter, let them tire slightly, then ask him. The first quarter mile went fast. General was running clean, smooth. Everything Cord knew how to do. The crowd was loud enough that she couldn't pick out individual sounds, just the wash of it, noise and motion all around. The second horse came up on General's outside, and they ran together briefly, testing each other, both horses burning energy. Midnight moved smoothly beneath her, still holding, 4th position, building. She could feel something happening in him. Something she'd felt in morning training when they hit the right point. A kind of gathering, like everything that was in him was collecting itself into a single focused intention. They hit the halfway point. "Okay," she said, and she let him go. What happened next was something she had felt in training and had tried to prepare herself for, and had not fully prepared herself for, nonetheless. Midnight ran. Not the way the other horses ran. Controlled, mechanical, worked. He ran the way he ran in the Montana fields when she first let him loose after his injury healed. The way that made her stand at the fence and lose words for it. He ran like a decision, like something chosen and committed to absolutely. He moved through 3rd position without effort. 2nd position without strain. The crowd shifted. She felt the sound change, felt the attention of hundreds of people turn, felt the moment when people realized something was happening that hadn't been expected. She was level with Cord and General at the 3-quarter mark. Cord felt her presence and glanced sideways. For the first time, his professional calm showed a crack. Just a small one, just a flicker of surprise. He asked more of General. The gray horse gave it, because General was good, genuinely good, and he had heart. But Midnight had something else. Midnight had a year of mornings, a year of cold Montana air, and Samuel's patient teaching, and her voice telling him that the world was safe now, and that whatever came before was over. He had the river and the barn and the months of trust built one small gesture at a time. He had everything she'd put into him, and somehow, in the way that horses carry what's been given to them, he had all of it in his legs right now. She leaned forward. The finish line appeared. She didn't look at General. She looked forward. Midnight crossed the line. The roar hit her like a wave. She didn't understand it for a moment. The sound, the enormity of it. The way the crowd had erupted in a way that seemed disproportionate to what had just happened. Then she realized. They had seen it too. Whatever quality Midnight had, whatever it was that made Samuel say he's better than all 3, the crowd had seen it. Not just the win. The way the win had happened. She slowed him gradually, letting him come down from the run, talking to him, steady and low, the way she always did. "Good boy," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Good boy. That's it. That's everything." Midnight tossed his head once, shaking something off, and then settled into her hands and walked. Samuel was at the rail when she rode back. He was standing very still, which was how Samuel showed emotion. Everything went still in him, like he was trying to contain something. She stopped Midnight in front of him. Samuel looked at the horse for a long moment. Then he looked up at her. His eyes were wet. He didn't do anything about that. He just let it be. "That's the fourth horse," he said. "I told you there were 3 in my life." He shook his head slightly. "That's the fourth." She got down from Midnight. Her legs were less steady than she'd expected. Samuel gripped her arm, briefly, the grip of someone steadying someone else. Then he released it. The race committee official came with the winner's documentation and the prize money envelope. She signed the paperwork with a hand that she made steady through sheer will. The prize was significant. Significant enough that she stood with the envelope in her hand and couldn't quite make herself real to herself. Thomas Whitaker found her 20 minutes later. He came through the thinning crowd with his hat in his hand. First time she'd ever seen him carry his hat rather than wear it. And she thought about that, what it meant, the deliberateness of that gesture. He stopped in front of her. "That horse," Thomas said. "Where did he come from?" "A river," she said. Something passed through his face. "I made a mistake." "Yes," she said. "More than one," he said. She waited. "I'd like to—" Thomas stopped. Started again. For the first time in her experience of him, Thomas Whitaker looked like a man who was genuinely uncertain what words to use. "I handled this wrongly, from the beginning. Not just the horse, the—" He gestured slightly, a vague, uncharacteristic gesture. "The way I spoke to you, at the river, over the winter, the fences." He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "Are you apologizing, Thomas?" she said. He looked at her. "I'm trying to," he said. The honesty of that disarmed her somewhat. She had been prepared for negotiation, for a new offer, for the next move in the game. She had not been prepared for a man who was genuinely trying to say something real. "I accept it," she said. Not warmly, but cleanly. He nodded. He put his hat back on. "That breeding program you're building," he said. "The one Samuel Brooks has been helping you with." Her eyes sharpened. "How do you know about that?" "I pay attention," he said. "I've been paying attention to you since last October, whether you wanted me to or not." A pause. "I made the mistake of underestimating you once. I'm not going to do it again." "What are you saying?" she said. "I'm saying," Thomas said carefully, "that there may come a time when you need capital that a single race prize doesn't provide. And when that time comes, I'd like you to consider coming to me. Not for a sale. Not for a partnership that benefits me at your expense." He held her gaze. "Something fair. If you're ever interested in something fair." She studied him. "I'll think about it," she said. It wasn't yes. He knew it wasn't yes. But it also wasn't the door closing. He nodded once. He left. Samuel appeared at her elbow as she watched Thomas go. "What did he want?" Samuel asked. "To apologize," she said, "and to leave a door open." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Do you trust him?" "Not entirely," she said, "but I trust him more than I did this morning." She looked at the envelope in her hand. At midnight, calm and dark and extraordinary in the afternoon light. "Winning changes things," she said. "Not everything, but things." "Yes," Samuel said. "It does." She looked at him. "Let's go home," she said. Samuel nodded. And for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, going home felt like going toward something instead of just going back. They came home to Willow Creek Valley on a Friday afternoon, and the valley looked the same as it always had. Same mountains, same wide sky, same familiar shape of the land she had been working for 3 years alone. But something had shifted. Not in the valley. In the way people looked at her when she rode through town with Midnight tethered behind the wagon and Samuel sitting quiet beside her. Word had traveled faster than they had. That was Montana in 1879. News moved on horseback and by telegraph and through the particular efficiency of communities where everyone knew everyone and information was the only currency that cost nothing to pass along. By the time Abigail turned onto the main street of Willow Creek, Cal Morrison was standing outside his feed store with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that she'd never seen directed at her before. He raised a hand when she passed. She nodded back. 3 other people did the same thing before she reached the edge of town. Small gestures, a tipped hat, a nod from a doorway. The kind of acknowledgement that in a small valley meant considerably more than it looked like from the outside. May Thornton was waiting at her gate, not alone. 2 of the women who'd come with her before were there as well, and they had a covered dish between them and expressions that mixed pride with the particular satisfaction of people who had bet correctly on something. "We heard," May said, before Abigail had even fully stopped the wagon. "News travels," Abigail said. She was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been running on will and tension for the better part of a week, and was only now allowing herself to feel the cost of it. "It certainly does," May said. She looked at Midnight with the focused attention of a woman who understood what she was looking at. "He's more beautiful than I expected," she said quietly. "He always is," Abigail said. They ate together that evening. Abigail and Samuel and May Thornton and her 2 companions, around Abigail's kitchen table, with the covered dish opened and the prize money envelope sitting on the counter like a fact that hadn't quite been absorbed yet. They talked about the race, about the hearing, about Hadley and Garrison and Chairman Reeves's expression when the objection was denied. May Thornton listened to all of it with the quiet attention of a woman who had been listening carefully to things for 60 years and had learned which details mattered. When Abigail finished, May said, "And Whitaker?" "He apologized," Abigail said. May raised her eyebrows. "Genuinely?" "As genuinely as a man like Thomas Whitaker apologizes for anything," Abigail said. "Which is more than I expected." May was quiet for a moment. "He'll come around," she said. "Not because he's changed his nature, because you've changed the calculation." She looked at Abigail. "Men like Thomas don't change who they are, but sometimes they change what they decide is worth fighting against. You've made yourself too expensive to fight." Samuel nodded slowly at this, the nod of a man who found it accurate. "That's not the same as trust," Abigail said. "No," May agreed. "It's not, but it's a start." After they left, and Samuel had gone home to his 20 acres of rocks, and Abigail was alone in the kitchen, she sat at the table for a long time without doing anything. The prize money envelope was in front of her. The ranch was quiet. Midnight was in the barn. She thought about what came next. Not the immediate next. She knew the immediate next. Pay the remaining feed debt. Fix the roof section. Invest in the south pasture wells she'd been planning since winter. Start the breeding program in earnest. Those were the practical steps, and she had them mapped clearly. She was thinking about the larger next, the shape of what she was building, what it could become. She picked up the pencil she kept on the table and began to write, in the margins of the only paper she had nearby, an old receipt from Morrison's, the outline of something she hadn't yet let herself call a plan, because calling it a plan made it real and real things could fail. She wrote it anyway. A breeding program based on Midnight's bloodline. Careful, documented, scientific in its approach. Not the haphazard way most valley ranchers bred, throw 2 animals together and hope for the best. But the method Samuel had been teaching her all year. Recording lineage, measuring outcomes, selecting for the qualities that mattered in Montana. Endurance, intelligence, temperament, the ability to work in hard conditions without breaking down. She wrote until the candle burned low. Then she went to check on Midnight one last time and stood in the barn doorway for a few minutes, listening to him breathe. "We're just getting started," she told him. He didn't answer, because he was a horse, but his ear turned toward her voice, and that was enough. The summer of 1879 was the best of the 3 she'd spent alone on the ranch, and also the busiest. The prize money solved the immediate problems, and the breeding program created new ones. Good problems, the kind that come from growth rather than desperation. 3 ranchers from outside the valley contacted her about breeding opportunities with Midnight within 2 months of the race. She accepted 2 of them on her terms, with agreements she had Hadley review before she signed anything. She hired Eli Hatch full-time. He was 18 now, quiet and steady, and better with horses than anyone she'd met outside of Samuel. She paid him a fair wage and gave him clear responsibilities and discovered something that probably should have been obvious to her earlier, that having one reliable person working alongside her changed everything about what was possible. "You should have hired someone 2 years ago," Samuel told her one afternoon in August. "I couldn't afford it 2 years ago," she said. "You could have afforded something," Samuel said. "You were running yourself into the ground trying to do everything alone." She looked at him. "Are you telling me I was being stubborn?" "I'm telling you," Samuel said carefully, "that there's a difference between independence and isolation. You know the difference now. 2 years ago, I'm not sure you did." She thought about that. He wasn't wrong. In the early years after Daniel died, she'd conflated the two, as if accepting help was the same as admitting she couldn't survive, as if the whole precarious structure of her self-reliance would collapse the moment she leaned on someone. She'd been wrong about that. The year with Samuel had proved it. Help didn't collapse you. The right help, freely given, honestly offered, made you more of what you already were, not less. "You're right," she said. Samuel looked briefly startled. He'd been bracing for an argument. "I know," he said, recovering quickly. "I usually am." She almost laughed. Samuel Brooks almost never made jokes. The fact that he'd made one now, easy and dry, told her something about how far they'd both come. The first hint of what was coming arrived in September. It came as a dry spell, not unusual for Montana in early fall, nothing that set off immediate alarm. But it persisted into October, which was unusual, and by November, it had a quality that old-timers in the valley started talking about at the feed store, in the particular low voices of people who've lived somewhere long enough to know when the land is trying to tell them something. "Rain's late," Cal Morrison said, when Abigail came in for her November order. "I noticed," she said. "Real late," he said. "Old Henderson, the one who's still here, on the north side, he's saying it's going to be bad. Says the last time the fall rain didn't come in October, they had drought the next year that lasted 18 months. "When was that?" Abigail asked. 63, Cal said. "Before your time in the valley, before most people's time." He paused. "Lot of ranches didn't make it through." She bought her supplies and drove home and went straight to Samuel. I was already waiting for her, which told her he'd been thinking about the same thing. "How bad?" "Bad," she said, before she was fully through his door. "Bad," Samuel said. He didn't dress it up. If the old-timers are talking about 63, they're not exaggerating to frighten themselves. The signs are similar. The timing is similar. He looked at her. "You need to prepare." "Tell me what I need," she said. He told her. She spent the next 3 months doing things that the rest of the valley largely wasn't doing yet, because most of the valley was still in the comfortable middle stage of concern, aware that something might be coming, not yet convinced it was real enough to act on dramatically. She dug the south pasture wells. She had Eli reinforce the water storage systems on the ranch. She bought hay at prices that seemed excessive in November and would seem like genius by spring. She made decisions about which of her cattle to sell now, at current prices, so she could afford to maintain the core breeding stock through whatever came. She consulted with Samuel on the pasture management, rotating which sections got grazed, preserving the deepest-rooted grasses, giving the land every chance she could. She worked herself harder than she had since the first winter after Daniel died. But this time, it felt different. This time she wasn't working from fear. She was working from knowledge, and the distinction mattered in ways she felt in her body. She was tired at night in the good, used way of someone who'd accomplished something, rather than the anxious, running from something tiredness that had defined those early years. And through all of it, midnight. The breeding program was producing results that she was only beginning to understand the significance of. 3 mares had been bred to midnight, 2 outside the valley, 1 of her own. The outcomes were still months away, the foals not yet born, but the interest from buyers who had heard about the territorial race win was real and growing, and she had a waiting list that would have seemed impossible a year ago. She was building something. She could feel it taking shape the way you feel a structure under your hands as you build it. Solid here, needs reinforcement there. This section is stronger than I thought. It was in December, During the first hard frost that confirmed the dry spell concern was becoming something more serious, that Thomas Whitaker came to her fence again. She saw him coming from the barn window and allowed herself one long breath before she went out. He looked different than he had in Billings. Not worse exactly. Thomas always carried himself well, but something in him had less of its usual certainty, like a man who had been running on momentum and had found himself standing still for the first time in a while. "Thomas," she said. "Abigail." He looked at her. "I have a proposition, and I want to be clear that it's different from the ones I've made before." "I'm listening," she said. And she was. She'd learned enough about Thomas Whitaker in the past year to know when he was performing and when he was being real. This had the quality of the second thing. "The drought is going to be worse than people think," he said. "I've had 3 different sources tell me that, and my own reading of the land agrees." He paused. "I have capital, more capital than most people in this valley combined. What I don't have—" He stopped. "Water," she said. He blinked. "Yes." She'd been watching Thomas's land all fall. He'd expanded aggressively over the years, always buying, always adding acreage. But he'd bought for surface area, not for water access. The Henderson property he'd acquired in '71 had good grass but shallow water table. His other acquisitions were similar. He'd built an empire on land that looked excellent in good years and would be desperately exposed in a sustained drought. "You dug wells," Thomas said. It wasn't accusatory, just observational. The tone of a man who had noticed too late what someone else had seen earlier. "In October," she said, when the old-timers started talking. Thomas looked at her. "You prepared?" "Yes, I—" He stopped, looked away briefly, then back. "I did not prepare, not sufficiently." He was quiet for a moment. It clearly cost him something to say the next thing. "I need to partner with someone who has water access and feed reserves through the next 18 months, and I need that partnership to be with someone who knows what they're doing." She looked at him steadily. "You're asking me." "I'm asking you," he said. "Yes." The silence stretched between them. A year ago, this conversation would have been impossible to imagine. Thomas Whitaker, the most powerful man in the valley, standing at her fence, asking for her help. The man who'd laughed at her in the river mud, who'd tried to buy midnight for $200, who'd filed a legal objection to block her from the race. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this moment, which was not triumph. She'd thought it would feel like triumph. It felt instead like something more complicated and more honest. The particular feeling of a moment that contains the entire journey that led to it. "Tell me the specific terms you're proposing," she said. He told her. It was, to his credit, genuinely fair. Access to her water and hay reserves in exchange for capital investment in expanding her breeding program. A documented agreement, not a handshake arrangement. She would retain full ownership of Midnight and all breeding rights. He would have access to water for his cattle at a set price per head and first right of negotiation on Midnight's offspring. Not automatic ownership, not control, just first conversation. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I want Hadley to review the agreement before I sign." "Of course," Thomas said. "And I want a clause that specifies clearly that any arrangement between us does not give you authority over ranch decisions. Management stays mine." "Agreed," he said. "And I want it known in the valley," she said. "Not hidden. If we're working together, people know we're working together, and they know the terms." Thomas looked at her for a moment. She could see him calculating something. Then he nodded. "Agreed," he said again. She looked at him. "You're taking this better than I expected," she said, "accepting my conditions." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone of a man who has been doing some honest accounting of himself, he said, "I'm 63 years old, Abigail. I've spent 30 years in this valley being the largest force in it. I've bought land, and I've built things, and I've done some things I wouldn't do differently, and some things I would." He paused. "What I've never done is partner with someone because they were genuinely better at something than I was." He looked at her. "You prepared for this drought. I didn't. You built that horse into what he is. I abandoned him." He shook his head slightly. "At some point, a man has to decide whether being right matters more than being effective. And he paused again. "I'm deciding." It was the most honest thing she'd ever heard Thomas Whitaker say. "I'll send the agreement to Hadley," she said. "You'll have my answer in 2 weeks." He nodded. He put his hat on. He left. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and thought about Daniel, the way she sometimes did when something significant happened. Thought about what he would have made of this moment, this conversation, the shape her life had taken. She thought he would have been surprised. She thought he might have also been proud, though Daniel had not been a man who said that kind of thing easily. She thought he would have liked midnight. She signed the agreement in January, after Hadley had reviewed it twice and added 3 clauses she hadn't thought of, and removed one that Thomas's lawyer had inserted that was less innocent than it looked. She signed it in Hadley's office in Billings with Thomas on the other side of the table, and Hadley witnessed it, and when it was done, Thomas put out his hand. She shook it. "I'd like to see him sometime," Thomas said. "Midnight, properly. Not from a fence. Come by the ranch," she said. "I'll introduce you." Something crossed Thomas's face that might, in a different kind of man, have been called moved. "I'd like that," he said. The drought arrived in full force by February of 1880, and it was as bad as the old-timers had said. The grass that should have come up in March was sparse and dry before it started. The water sources that normally swelled with snowmelt were running thin. By April, ranches across Willow Creek Valley were in trouble. The ones who came to Abigail first were the ones she expected, the families on the margins, the smaller ranches that had been running thin for years and couldn't absorb a bad season. They came not asking for charity, but for practical help. Access to water at a reasonable price, hay at cost rather than at the inflated drought prices that outside suppliers were beginning to charge. She helped them, not out of surplus. She was being careful, calculating every allocation, making sure she didn't overextend. But where she could help, she did. And she did it at prices that were fair rather than opportunistic. Samuel watched this with approval, but also with the practical concern of a man who understood margins. "You're going to run thinner than I'd like," he told her. "I know," she said. "Why not hold more back?" he said. "You've earned the right to be self-protective." She thought about this. It was a fair question. "Because when I was thin," she said slowly, "nobody helped me. Not really. May Thornton's group gave me travel money, and that was genuine, and I won't forget it. But the years before that, 3 years of running as hard as I could with nothing and nobody saying, 'Here, let me make it easier.' I know what that costs." She looked at Samuel. "If I can make it easier for someone and I don't, because I'm protecting my margin, then I've become something I don't want to be." Samuel was quiet. "Besides," she said more practically, "the capital arrangement with Thomas covers the gap. I did the numbers. I can afford to be generous and still come through." "You did the numbers," Samuel said, with a tone that suggested he found this both predictable and impressive. "I always do the numbers," she said. The moment that the valley remembered came in late April. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every other way, when Jim Aldridge came to her gate at 7 in the morning with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who was past the point of pride. "I need help," Jim said. "I've got 40 head that are going to start dying if I don't get water to them in the next week. My wells are dry. I've got nothing." She looked at him. Jim Aldridge had been at the river. Jim Aldridge had sat on his horse and said nothing when Thomas talked to her in the mud. Jim Aldridge had come to her fence in January to warn her about the race committee objection, which had been something, but he had also spent years being in Thomas's orbit and staying quiet when quiet cost her. She looked at him now. This man who was not bad, just limited, just someone who had defaulted to the strongest current until the current turned. And she made a decision. "Bring them over," she said. Jim exhaled. Something visibly went out of him, the held tension of a man who hadn't been sure which way this was going to go. "Abigail, Jim," she said, "bring them over. I'll work out a payment arrangement with you that's fair, Bring Eli into the conversation and we'll figure out the logistics. She paused. But I want to say something first. He looked at her. I don't hold what happened at the river against you, she said. Not anymore. You warned me about the committee, and I know that took something, and I'm aware of it. She held his gaze. But I want you to know that what I'm doing right now has nothing to do with that, and nothing to do with what you did or didn't do before. I'm helping your cattle because they're living animals, and they're thirsty, and I have water. That's the whole reason. Jim Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he's keeping something in. Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. He brought his cattle over that afternoon. Within 2 weeks, she had arrangements with 4 families. She had Thomas's capital covering the costs, her own reserves providing the buffer, and Eli managing the practical logistics with a competence that made her grateful every single day that she'd hired him. Samuel came every morning, the way he always had. He was 71 now, and the winter had been hard on him in ways he didn't mention, and she didn't ask about directly, but she noticed. The deliberateness of his movements had deepened into something slightly slower. He still came. Every morning. One morning in May, when the valley was dry and struggling, and her ranch was an island of relative stability in the middle of it. Samuel came into the barn and stood watching her work with one of the mares from the breeding program. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked up. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before. I'm going to be slowing down, Samuel said. My back. He paused. I'm not going to be able to come every morning much longer. She put down what she was doing and turned fully to face him. He was looking at the mare, not at her. His face had the controlled expression of a man delivering news he doesn't want to deliver. How long do you have? She said. Years yet, God willing, Samuel said, with a brief dry tone that told her he'd understood her real question. I'm old, Abigail, not dying, but I can't keep the pace I've kept. He paused. And you don't need me the way you did. She opened her mouth to argue this and stopped. He was right. She had learned what he'd taught her. She had built what he'd helped her see was possible. She knew these horses now, their personalities, their needs, the specifics of this breeding program, in the way you know something you've built yourself. She didn't need a teacher anymore. That didn't make it easier. Samuel, she said. Don't, he said gently. I was going to say thank you, she said. He looked at her. His pale, faded eyes were very steady. You went into the river, he said. I just helped you understand what you pulled out of it. She breathed. You'll still come, she said. When you can? Just not every morning. I'll still come, he said. When I can. He looked at Midnight in the far stall. I couldn't stay away from that horse if I tried. She nodded. She turned back to the mare. She kept working, because that was what she did, because the work had always been the way she held herself together when things shifted beneath her. But she felt it. The ending of something, and the beginning of something else, simultaneously, the way life insisted on being. Nothing ever cleanly finished, everything always turning into the next thing before you'd fully absorbed the last one. That evening, Thomas Whitaker came to the ranch for the first time since the partnership agreement had been signed. He came as a guest, not a negotiator. She'd extended the invitation she'd offered in Billings, and he'd taken her up on it at a moment when perhaps neither of them was performing anything. She introduced him to Midnight in the barn. Thomas stood in front of the horse for a long moment. Midnight regarded him with those dark, assessing eyes that had always seen more than they let on. He's bigger than I remembered, Thomas said. He grew into himself, Abigail said. Thomas extended a hand. Midnight lowered his head slightly, regarded the hand, and then, slowly, in the careful way he did things, pushed his nose briefly against Thomas's palm. Thomas Whitaker stood very still. I was wrong about him, Thomas said. His voice was quiet. You were, she said. No softening, but not unkind. Thomas was quiet for another moment. I was wrong about a great many things, he said. She looked at him. Are you looking for absolution, Thomas? He thought about that, genuinely thought about it, which surprised her. "No," he said. "I don't think so. I think I just—" He paused. "I needed to stand here, in this barn, and say it directly." He looked at her. "You built something real, Abigail. From nothing. From worse than nothing. And you built it the right way." She held his gaze. "I had help," she said. "I learned that's not a weakness." Thomas smiled. It was a smaller smile than his usual ones, more real. "No," he said. "I'm learning that too." They walked out of the barn together, into the May evening. The valley was dry and worried, but not broken. Not yet. And, because of the work she'd done, the choices she'd made, the help she'd given and accepted, maybe not broken at all. She stood at the barn door after Thomas left, looking at her land. 60 acres. It was still 60 acres. She hadn't bought more. That wasn't her ambition, to swallow the valley the way Thomas had tried to. Her ambition was different. To make what she had the best it could be. To build things that lasted. To be the kind of person whose presence in a community made the community stronger. She thought she was getting there. Midnight moved in the barn behind her. She heard his hooves on the floor, the soft sound of him settling, the breeding mare in the next stall. Eli's careful voice somewhere at the far end, finishing up the evening routine. The south pasture wells she'd dug. The hay reserves that were feeding Jim Aldridge's cattle and 2 other families' herds right now. The foals that weren't born yet, but were coming. Midnight's bloodline, carrying forward whatever it was in him that made Samuel say, "He's the 4th in the voice of a man who didn't say things lightly." She was 42 years old. She had been a widow for 5 years. She had 60 acres and a horse that had won a territorial race and a partnership agreement with the most powerful man in the valley and a lawyer in Billings who she trusted, and a young man who was becoming genuinely good at this work, and an old cavalryman who had given her the best year of teaching she'd ever received. She had, she realized, a life, not the life she'd planned. Not the life that had existed before February of 1875 when fever took Daniel in 4 days and left her standing at a cold grave with a thin dress and nowhere obvious to go. A different life. One she had built herself, from a cold riverbank and a dying horse, and the decision, not calculated, not strategic, just human and stubborn and possibly slightly reckless, not to walk away. She breathed the May evening into her lungs. Then she went to check on the horses one last time, because the horses still needed checking, because the work didn't stop just because the moment was significant, because that was the truth of a life built on something real rather than something performed. The work was always there, and she had always shown up for it. The drought broke in October of 1880. It broke the way. Montana storms broke. Suddenly, without apology, rain coming down so hard one Thursday night that Abigail lay awake listening to it. Hit the roof and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight for 18 months. She lay there in the dark listening to the rain and the sound of the horses moving in the barn, and Eli's boots crossing the yard to check on them, and she thought, simply and completely, we made it. Not everyone had. 4 ranches in the valley had sold during the drought. 2 families had left entirely, packed their wagons and gone to Oregon, to California, to somewhere that felt less like it was testing you every single season. The valley had a different shape to it now, with those absences. Not broken, but changed. Leaner. More honest about what it took to stay. Thomas Whitaker had made it through, partly because of his capital, and partly because of her water access, and he was honest enough to say so directly when the rain came. He came to her gate on the first clear morning after the storm, and he didn't bring a proposition or a negotiation. He just came. "We made it," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her land, at the grass that was already beginning to respond to the rain with the particular urgency of things that have been waiting. "You carried 4 families through this," he said, "not counting my cattle." "Eli did most of the practical work," she said. "Eli works for you," Thomas said. "That's not the same thing." He paused. "There are people in this valley who would not still be here if you had not prepared the way you did." He looked at her. "You know that." She didn't argue it. It was true, and she knew it was true, and she had made her peace with knowing it without needing it said out loud. But she found, now that it was being said, that it mattered. Not for her pride, for something quieter than pride. The confirmation that what she'd chosen to do with what she had built had been the right use of it. The drought showed people things, she said. About who was ready and who wasn't. About what kind of ranching actually survives. It showed them about you, Thomas said. It showed them about preparation, she said firmly. Anyone who'd prepared would have been in the same position. Thomas looked at her with that expression he'd developed over the past 18 months, the one that mixed respect with something that was almost frustration, as if he found her insistence on deflecting credit genuinely difficult to navigate. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever known," he said. "Thank you," she said pleasantly. He shook his head slightly, but he was smiling. It was a real smile, the kind that had nothing behind it, and she had come to find those rarer and more valuable than all the performances that had preceded them. The valley's reckoning with what the drought had revealed came gradually, the way those kinds of reckonings always came. Not in one dramatic moment, but in accumulated small ones. Conversations at the feed store and at church and over fences that slowly shifted the way people talked about things. About land management, about water, about the difference between owning a lot of something and understanding it. About Abigail Carter. She was aware of the shift. It was impossible not to be, in a valley small enough that she knew every face and most of the conversations behind them. The things people said about her were different now. Not just the surface difference. Not just the shift from widow woman who saved a worthless horse to woman who won the territorial race, but something deeper. The way she was talked about had changed from someone people watched with the particular mixture of pity and doubt they reserved for anyone trying to beat long odds, to someone people looked to, consulted, deferred to, in the specific ways that communities defer to the people who have demonstrated that they know what they're doing when it counts. May Thornton said it plainly, as May Thornton always said things. She came in December, just herself this time. No covered dish, no group. She came and sat at Abigail's kitchen table with her coffee and her 60-year-old eyes and said, "You know what you are now." "I'm a rancher," Abigail said. "You're the rancher," May said. "In this valley. When people have a question about land or water or horses or what to do when the season turns bad, you're the name they say." She held Abigail's gaze. "How does that feel?" Abigail thought about it honestly. "Strange," she said. "It feels strange. 6 years ago, I was Daniel Carter's wife. 4 years ago, I was a widow that everyone expected to fail. 2 years ago, I was the woman who wasted time on a worthless horse." She paused. "And now..." "Now you're yourself," May said simply. "It took a while for everyone else to catch up to that, but you've been yourself the whole time." Abigail sat with that. "Daniel would have found all of this very surprising," she said. "Would he?" May asked. She thought about that, honestly thought about it, the way she did sometimes, really looking at Daniel as he actually was, rather than as grief had softened him. He had been a good man, a man of his time, a man who had not fully seen what was in front of him. He would have been proud, she said. Eventually, after the surprise. May smiled. "Most good men are like that," she said. "They need a minute." The first of Midnight's offspring was born in February of 1881, a filly, black like her father, with the same quality about her that Abigail had first seen in Midnight on that riverbank, that look of something not quite finished, deciding what it was going to become. She was born in the early morning, just after 4, Abigail and Eli both there, both of them barely breathing for the last few minutes of it. When it was done and the filly was standing, unsteady, insistent, already making her legs work through sheer necessity. Abigail sat back on her heels and looked at her. "Well," Eli said beside her. His voice had the quality of someone who had just seen something they were going to remember. "Yes," Abigail said. She named the filly Dawn, not because she was born at dawn, though she was, but because of what she represented, the thing that comes after the dark part, the thing that was always coming even when you couldn't see it yet. Samuel came to see her the week after she was born. He walked slowly now, the winter having deepened what the previous one had started. But he came. He stood at the stall for a long time looking at Dawn with those faded cavalry eyes that had seen so much and held so much and still, after everything, found new things worth looking at. "She has it," he said finally. "I think so too," Abigail said. "Whatever it is," Samuel said. "That quality. I don't have a better word for it than that." He shook his head slightly. "That's the thing about Midnight. It wasn't just him. It was in him to give." He looked at Abigail. "That's what you saved. Not just a horse, not just a bloodline. You saved a thing that could keep passing itself forward." She looked at Dawn, that small, insistent, already determined filly. And she understood what Samuel meant in a way she felt rather than thought. You never know what you're saving when you save something. You only know what's in front of you. You only know what's still fighting. The breeding program grew through 1881, with a momentum that began to take on its own logic, independent of any single decision she made. 6 mares bred that year. 4 from outside the valley, 2 her own. The waiting list had gone from 3 names to 11. A man had come from as far as Wyoming, specifically to negotiate a breeding contract, and had left after 2 hours with exactly the agreement Abigail was willing to give him, and not 1 term more. Eli managed most of the day-to-day operations now. He had grown into himself the way Midnight had grown into himself. Not all at once, but steadily. The quality that had always been there becoming more visible as the years gave it room. He was 20 now, serious about the work, genuinely skilled, and she was aware that at some point in the not-too-distant future, he was going to want something of his own. She was already thinking about what that might look like, how to help him toward it without losing what he contributed to what she'd built. That was the thing about building something real. You started thinking about who came after you. She had not thought about that in the early years. Survival didn't leave room for legacy. But she was thinking about it now, and the thinking had a particular quality. Not melancholy, not the anxious counting of what she'd leave behind, but something more like curiosity. Like the next chapter was something she was genuinely interested in seeing. It was in April of 1881 that Jim Aldridge came to her with the proposal. He came without his hat in his hands this time. He came standing straight, the way a man stands when he's bringing something he believes in rather than something he's ashamed of. "I want to learn," he said. "What you know. About the land management, the water systems, the breeding selection. Not to compete with you. I'm not trying to build what you've built. But the South Valley families, the ones who almost didn't make it through the drought, they need someone who can help them do this right. Someone who's close." He looked at her. "I thought if I understood it better, I could help them." She studied him. Jim Aldridge had been traveling a longer road than he got credit for, she thought. From the man on the horse at the riverbank, saying nothing, to the man who'd warned her about the committee, to the man who'd come with his hat in his hands needing water for his cattle, to this. A man standing straight and asking to learn so he could help other people. People could change. Not their nature, maybe, but what they did with it. She believed that. She had to believe it, because she had changed too. Not what she was, but what she understood about what she was. "Come by Saturday morning," she said. 6 o'clock. Bring something to write with." Jim blinked, like he'd expected more conditions. "That's it?" he said. "That's it," she said. "If you're serious, 6 o'clock Saturday will tell me." He was there at 5:55. She taught him the way Samuel had taught her, not by lecturing, but by doing and explaining while they did. She taught him about water table reading and well placement. She taught him about pasture rotation and which grasses held through drought and which ones looked good until they didn't. She taught him about the specific demands of Montana land, the way it required a different relationship than land in easier climates. Not just ownership, but attention, constant reading, the willingness to listen to what the land was saying and adjust. How was a good student? Slower than her, more cautious, but thorough. He didn't skip steps, and he asked questions when he didn't understand something, which she respected. 3 months in, she told him. You're going to be good at this. He looked up from the water management notes he'd been reviewing. You think so? You care about it for the right reasons, she said. That matters more than natural aptitude. I was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, he said, I owe you an apology. A real one. Not just coming to warn you about the committee. That was the least I could do. I mean for the river. For staying quiet when I should have said something. She looked at him. I know, she said. I was a coward, he said. You were a man doing what felt safe, she said. That's not the same thing. But it's also not what I needed from you that morning. She held his gaze. You've spent 2 years doing things that needed doing and not waiting for credit. That's worth something, Jim. His jaw moved in that way it did when he was holding something in. I just wanted to say it directly, he said, before we went further. I heard you, she said. Now let's go look at the east well. He nodded. He followed her out. And that was that. Clean. Done. The apology said and received and placed where it belonged. In the past, where it could stop costing both of them the energy of carrying it unspoken. Samuel came in June, on a warm morning when the valley was green again for the first time in 2 years. The rain having done its work, and the land responding with the generosity it always showed when it had been given what it needed. He came slowly, with the walking stick he hadn't been using the last time she saw him. He stood at the barn door and looked at midnight in the paddock. 10 years old now, still deeply black, still moving with that quality that she had never found a better word for than the one Samuel had used. Presence. He looks well, Samuel said. He is well, she said. Better than me, most mornings. Samuel smiled. A real one, reaching his eyes. He didn't smile easily, and so she had learned to pay attention when he did. They stood together watching midnight move. The morning was warm. The valley was quiet in the particular way of valleys that have been through something hard and have come out the other side. I need to tell you something, Samuel said. She waited. I'm proud of you, he said. Quietly, plainly, the way Samuel said things that cost him something to say, without ceremony, because ceremony would make it smaller. I have been for a long time, and I should have said it sooner. She stood with that for a moment. You didn't need to say it, she said. I knew. Still needed saying, Samuel said. She looked at him. 72 years old, thinner than he'd been, leaning slightly on the walking stick, those pale cavalry eyes steady as they'd always been. You changed my life, she said. I want you to know I know that. No, Samuel said. You changed your life. He paused. I recognized what you were doing, and I showed up. He looked at her. Which is all any of us can really do for each other. She thought about that. About what it meant to recognize what someone was doing and decide to show up for it. About how rare that was and how much it mattered when it happened. Will you stay for breakfast? She said. I will, he said. They ate together at her kitchen table, and it was a simple meal, eggs and bread and coffee. And they talked about Dawn and the South Pasture and the family from Wyoming who wanted a second breeding contract, and whether Eli was going to ask to buy into the operation or strike out on his own, which was the question that was becoming more pressing every month. It was ordinary, completely ordinary, and underneath the ordinariness was something that had no simple name, the particular quality of a morning shared between two people who had built something together and knew what the building had cost and were grateful for it without needing to say so every minute. When Samuel left, she walked him to the gate. He looked back once at the ranch, at the barn and the paddock and the pasture and the house with its repaired roof. And she saw him taking it in the way you take in something you've watched grow from a different thing into itself. Abigail, he said. Samuel. Keep going, he said. Just that. She nodded. He walked slowly down the road toward his 20 acres of rocks, and she watched him until the road turned and he disappeared from sight. Then she turned back to her land. The years after that accumulated the way good years do. Not in dramatic moments, but in the texture of days that were hard and full and meaningful. The breeding program established itself as something the territory recognized. Midnight's name, and the name Midnight Carter, the bloodline, appeared in conversations and correspondences across Montana and into Wyoming and Colorado. She received a letter from a ranch in Texas in 1883 inquiring about availability of offspring. She wrote back with her terms, and they agreed to all of them. Thomas Whitaker became, over time, something she had not predicted when she'd signed that agreement in Hadley's office. A genuine colleague. Not a friend exactly, not in the simple sense, but a person she respected and who respected her, who brought real knowledge and real resources to their working relationship, and who had kept every term of every agreement between them without requiring her to fight for it. He came to her one afternoon in the fall of 1883, sitting across her kitchen table with his hat on his knee, and said, "I want to expand the partnership, more capital into the breeding program, wider distribution of the offspring." She looked at the proposal he'd brought. "Why now?" she said. "Because I've spent 4 years watching what you've built," he said. "And I understand now what I didn't understand at the beginning." He paused. "This isn't just about horses. This is about a way of doing things, a way of building things that last." He looked at her steadily. "That's worth more than any single asset, and I want to be part of it." She read the proposal carefully. Then she said, "I'll send it to Hadley." Thomas smiled. That smaller, realer smile. "Of course you will. Don't sound resigned about it," she said. "It's the reason you haven't been cheated." He laughed. Actually laughed, which she'd heard him do genuinely exactly twice before. She signed the expanded agreement in November, and it was the beginning of something that grew over the next decade into one of the most significant horse breeding operations in the Montana Territory. But that was later. In the fall of 1883, standing at the fence of her paddock watching Dawn, 3 years old now, already showing what she was going to be, already carrying that quality forward the way Samuel had said she would. Abigail thought about the morning in August of 1878, when she'd heard a sound from the river and gone to see. She thought about the cold water and the mud and the weight of the animal she'd pulled out of it. She thought about Thomas's voice. Sentiment doesn't feed anyone through a Montana winter. She thought about Samuel appearing at her fence 3 days later with his hands in his pockets, deciding to show up. She thought about Robert Hadley and Jim Aldridge's notarized statement and the race committee and Cord's face when midnight passed him at the 3/4 mark. She thought about May Thornton at her gate with an envelope and 12 families' worth of belief inside it. She thought about the drought and Jim Aldridge's cattle and the South pasture wells and Eli's steady hands on everything she'd been building. She thought about Daniel, who had loved her imperfectly and been loved imperfectly in return, which was the only kind of loving there was, and who she still missed, not with the raw grief of those first years, but with the quieter, settled ache of someone who has made peace with a loss without pretending it didn't cost something. She thought about all of it, and she understood that there was no single moment that had made her life what it was. Not the river, not the race, not the drought, not the agreement with Thomas, or the teaching from Samuel, or the morning Dawn was born. It was all of it, moving together, each thing leading to the next in the way that lives lead, not like a plan, not like a story with a clear shape from the beginning, but like a river, which goes where it goes because of the specific landscape it moves through, and makes the landscape different by having moved through it. She had made this valley different. She knew that. Not by being the largest or the most powerful or the wealthiest, though the wealth had come, quietly and without fanfare, as the natural result of building something real and lasting. She had made it different by refusing to walk away from a dying horse in a cold river on a morning when everyone watching expected her to walk away. By understanding that what looked worthless from the outside sometimes contained everything. By learning the difference between isolation and independence, between stubbornness and strength, between protecting what was hers and being willing to share it when sharing it mattered more than keeping it. By showing up, every morning, no matter what the previous morning had cost. Midnight moved in the paddock behind her. Older now, the black of his coat deepened with age into something even richer. And Dawn moved beside him, that same quality in her stride, that same presence, that same refusal to be ordinary. Abigail Carter stood at the fence of her ranch on a fall morning in Montana in 1883, 50 years old and alone and not lonely. And she breathed the cold, clean air into her lungs and looked at what she had built. It was real. It was hers. And it had started with the choice to step into cold water when everyone else had already decided to walk away. Which meant it had always been hers, from the very first moment, before anyone else could see it. That was the truth of it. That was all of it. And it was more than